dislike or prejudice against people from other countries. Xenophobia, fear and hatred of strangers or foreigners, or of anything that is strange or foreign. Xenophobia, fear or dislike of the customs, dress, etc. of people who are culturally different to oneself. I wonder what comes to mind for you when you think about that word. Perhaps you've experienced xenophobia. I hope not, but perhaps. Or perhaps you can identify some traces of xenophobia in your own thoughts, words, or actions. When Jenny and I were on holiday in South Africa at the Kruger National Park, we had so many amazing experiences and met many wonderful people, but we were saddened when we heard some of the locals at one of the camps say that they believed the Kruger National Park should be for South Africans only. And our guide, who was from Zimbabwe, he thought that the comment was directed at him. We thought it was directed at us. But our guide, he said that in his experience, this xenophobic sentiment had been on the rise recently since the pandemic, where he worked in South Africa. That was only his experience. But our guide, he was often quite a sad, melancholy gentleman. He'd had a really tough life, but that was the only time we ever saw him agitated, when he heard those, what he saw, or what we saw as xenophobia. He was agitated. That's xenophobia. That's the response it can produce in us. During Advent, we've been watching a Christmas film each Wednesday night, and this week the film was called A Castle for Christmas. The film, many of you have already watched it, the film's all about an American woman making a trip to Scotland. Will she be accepted? Or will she experience xenophobia? Let's rewind a little, get some context. Sophie Brown is an American author who has been rejected by her fans. In her newest book, she killed off a beloved character, and now her fans have turned on her. And given this response to her new books, she feels the need to get away to a place where no one knows her and where she can work on her next book in peace. She decides that Scotland surely must be the place. We soon learn that Sophie's maiden name is McGinty, and she grew up hearing tales of Dunbar Castle, where her father was the son of the castle groundskeeper. Sophie wants to see the place her father grew up and work on her next book, but it's not quite as simple as that. Firstly, she can't understand the taxi driver's accent. It's as if he's speaking another language entirely. Secondly, she arrives at the inn where there is room for her, but the woman on the desk, Maisie, turns out to be a big fan of her writing, and Sophie is shocked. Is she going to be rejected by her Scottish fans too? Thankfully, Maisie thought that Sophie should have killed off that character right at the beginning of the series, and Maisie welcomes Sophie warmly. Maisie then introduces Sophie to this knitting group, a knitting group that meets in a pub. I love that. A knitting group that meets at the pub. It's a very diverse group, very open. Anyone can join this knitting group, and they will teach you to knit, and they'll talk and share stories. And they look out for each other, this knitting group. And they show Sophie, this stranger, generous hospitality. But this warm welcome at the inn contrasts with Sophie's first visit to Dunbar Castle. A workman gives her a tour, but what Sophie doesn't know is that this man is Miles Dunbar, the Duke and owner of the castle and the surrounding land. He's in disguise. At one point of the tour, Sophie sneaks off to find where her dad had carved his name in the castle as a boy. But Miles catches her and says, "Stay out of places you don't belong. Stay out of places you don't belong." Both Sophie and Miles, they fail to recognise the significance of the other. So Sophie does not recognise Miles as the Duke and owner of the castle, and Miles does not recognise Sophie as a famous author and a McGinty with family history in Scotland. Everything gets more complicated when Sophie, who is clearly very rich, this is the only time we find out or hear about it, she's clearly very rich, she makes an offer to buy the whole castle from Miles. But he doesn't want to sell. And yet he needs the money. He really needs the money. So he says yes, but he hatches a dishonest plan. He wants her deposit up front and then invites her to stay with him in the castle. He thinks that if he can show her how cold and leaky and inhospitable the castle is, she will feel so unwelcome that she'll eventually give up on the castle and go back home to America. She'll go back to where she came from. We might see a trace of xenophobia there. Sophie is welcomed at the inn by Maisie and the knitting group, but she's given a frosty reception at the castle by Miles, who intends to freeze her out, send her packing, stay out of places you don't belong. Miles could and should have taken his cue from his dog, Hamish, who immediately takes a liking to Sophie in the film and becomes her faithful companion. But Miles struggles to welcome this stranger. And I wonder if, see what you think, I wonder if the beginning of this film gives us a way into thinking about xenophobia in our world today. Because Miles welcomed Sophie to the castle, but with the hope that she'd find it so uncomfortable that she'd leave. That's really interesting. I think this highlights how xenophobia can at times be more subtle, more hidden behind apparently hospitable actions. Welcome, but I hope you leave soon, or I hope you don't cause trouble to us. That's not real hospitality. That's fake hospitality. And I wonder if the root cause for Miles in the film seems to be a failure to recognise that Sophie belongs. That she belongs in Scotland as much as anyone, and that she might actually enrich his life and the life of the community. He doesn't recognise her for who she is. When you meet a stranger, or a new person, or a strange person, or a person who is different from you and your people, where does your mind go? What goes on in your mind? Are you slow to recognise their significance, their potential to enrich your life or your community? And this is not a question of whether to be discerning or not when it comes to strangers. It's always wise to be discerning and trust our gut when we meet someone new. We often need to hold boundaries, but at best, discernment can actually enable curiosity and hospitality. We can hold some sensible boundaries while still learning about someone and welcoming them, showing them a really warm welcome. The two can go together. So this is not about not discerning about strangers. But if we are open, who the stranger is and how they might enrich our lives in the community can become clearer as we get to know them. But the inhospitable position is to fail to recognise the significance of the stranger, to, in essence, be closed to the stranger. And that's not discernment. It's xenophobia. During Advent and Christmas, we revisit again and again the story of God coming to us as a stranger in an unlikely form, not with power, not with might, but as a baby that most people did not recognise. Unlike Sophie in the film, for Jesus and his parents, there was no room at the inn. We're going to hear some verses now from Luke's Gospel and also from John's Gospel, and Maureen is going to come and read.
Morning. The first reading is from Luke 2, 1-7. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. Second reading comes from John 1, 9-14. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Amen.
So in those first verses, those verses from Luke, we hear that Joseph and Mary leave the place they live, Nazareth, to go to Bethlehem for a census. And so they are, to an extent, strangers in Bethlehem. Yes, Joseph has family history there, but it's interesting, there doesn't seem to be family and friends on hand to put them up for a night. Instead, we find that there is no room at the inn. And Jesus was laid in a manger, an animal feeding trough. And this is an interesting reading because it's a real blend of familiar and unusual. Because for the reader of the Hebrew Bible, or our Old Testament, the mention of the line of David and Bethlehem would bring to mind these amazing messianic prophecies that God's anointed, God's Messiah would come, will arrive. But then the actual events that happen, that Luke tells in his Gospel, are quite unusual. There was no room at the inn. People did not rush to open their homes to this heavily pregnant woman. That's quite unusual. And it culminates with that picture of the Son of God in human form being laid in an animal trough. What an unusual picture of hospitality. We get so used to it. We're like, of course, because many of us would have grown up hearing the nativity story. Of course that was where Jesus was laid. What? The Son of God, the Messiah, in an animal trough. Really? How hospitable. Surely then we can say that most failed to recognise the significance of these strangers from Nazareth. And who, without divine revelation, was able to recognise God in the face of that baby in the manger? All of this is then echoed in that second reading, John's Gospel, where we hear the astonishing words that though the world was made through him, the world did not recognise him. So despite the whole world coming into existence through God's word, the world failed to recognise God's word in person, God's word in flesh. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So John is saying that the world, God's very own world, perceives him as a stranger and fails to extend hospitality. Unlike Luke, John doesn't have a birth story about Jesus. Have you ever noticed that? No birth story in John's Gospel. And yet, it's incredible how the two gospel writers speak with one voice here. God came to us as a stranger. God came to us as a stranger, and most did not welcome him. And that inhospitality, like in our film from this week, came from a failure to recognise the significance of this stranger. Most were not open or curious or expecting this newborn to be anything special. And this continued when that tender baby grew up. He was rejected in his hometown and some years later was crucified. What kind of hospitality is that? What kind of welcome? To most, he was a stranger. And is it any different today? Who will welcome this stranger Jesus, a God who comes to us in weakness and vulnerability and asks us, will you play host? Will you play host? What kind of God is that? Who is this God who continues to show up in the faces of the weak and vulnerable people today? Jesus said in his parable of the sheep and the goats, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Will we recognise him if we see him? Most didn't. Today, most don't. But that's not the whole story. The inhospitality and failure to recognise in that reading from John is outweighed by something far better. John writes, yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children of God? Children of God? In a sense, aren't we all children of God? We all bear the divine image. God is the creator and source of all. We all belong, absolutely. But John is talking about something even more intimate than that. He's talking about us becoming like Jesus. Becoming like Jesus, sharing fully in the love between the persons of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son and Holy Spirit. Later in John's Gospel, Jesus prays this, righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. I have made you known to them and will continue to make you known in order that the love you have for me may be in them, and that I myself may be in them. And so by receiving Jesus or believing in his name, we are recognizing that he is sent by God to reveal God the Father's love. And yet the revelation is not enough. The revelation is not enough. The goal is for that love to actually be in us, to take up residence, to dwell in us and in the community as well. And that Father's love that was same love that was in Jesus, leading him to extraordinary acts of love in us too. That's what it means to be a child of God. It means receiving the love of God as a gift, using that as our power source in the world. It's a gift. And that's really interesting. I find that really interesting. It relates to what we looked at earlier. By receiving Jesus, by hosting Jesus, we are actually receiving the gift of God's love. It's a paradox. We are hosting, so we might feel we are the ones giving the gift, but actually we are the ones receiving the gift. We're receiving the gift as we welcome Jesus Christ. Let's go back to our Christmas film, see how it all fits together. Of course, it's a rom-com. Sophie and Miles, they fall in love, but that's not that interesting. We know what happens in rom-coms. What's interesting is the impact it has. As Miles lets Sophie into his life, she helps him to open up his castle to the wider community. And not only that, she helps him become more a part of the community. Because despite being the Duke there and everyone's landlord, no one actually has much of a relationship with him. He's aloof, superior, a loner. He goes to the inn, he doesn't know what to say to anyone, he starts playing darts on his own. In contrast, Sophia is a stranger, and yet she's friends with everyone. At one point, Miles gets really frustrated with all of this. He says, "You're too much." He says this to Sophie. "You're too much. You're everywhere. Are you going to run for mayor?" Miles is obviously attracted to Sophie, but he keeps pushing her away because he's scared. I often think that hate is not the opposite of love. Fear is the opposite of love. He's scared. He's struggling with this fear. He's scared that he's a nobody and that without the castle, he will have nothing. And actually, that is blocking love doing what it needs to do in his life. It's this fear. He pushes through that fear. Love guides him through that fear. And at the end of the film, he learns that it's not about the castle. That's not what makes him who he is. It's about the community that they've invited into the castle for a Christmas party. And right at the end of the film, Miles says to the community, Christmas is for being with those you love. That's all of you, your family. So just as Jesus brings the gift of the love of God to those who receive him, Sophie brings the gift of community and love to Miles. And by the end of the film, his fake hospitality that was bordering on xenophobia actually is transformed into genuine hospitality. He's completely changed. Welcoming Sophie in led him to actually welcome many other strangers into his life as family. He's no longer xenophobic. He even pays to fly over Sophie's daughter, yet another American, so that she can be with them at Christmas. And actually what he wanted in life was transformed by his encounter with Sophie. He no longer wants to be alone in his castle at Christmas. Instead, he is pleased to be with the community, Sophie and her daughter at Christmas. That's transformation, real transformation. But it all started with the welcoming of a stranger. Miles welcomed Sophie, and she became his guest. Then she helped him to host. She hosted, so that he was no longer a stranger to his own community. By hosting her, he received a gift. It's just the way it goes. It's the paradox. By hosting her, he received a gift. So a few questions for us towards the end of this sermon. Will our welcoming of God in Jesus Christ this Christmas lead us to welcome other strangers too? Let's welcome God and other strangers. Will it lead us to welcome other strangers? As a church, welcome other strangers. Will we be open to receiving a gift as we extend hospitality? Some of you will be extending hospitality this year, but will you have your eyes open to the gift that actually you will be receiving? Perhaps from strangers, perhaps not from strangers. And will we allow what we want in life to be transformed as we encounter the love of God revealed and given in Jesus Christ, this ongoing transformation? Will our wants, will that change as we welcome the love of God into our lives? Love often transforms as we welcome it. One final thought. Seems to me that the hospitality of the knitting group was constantly and faithfully running throughout the film. Did you notice that if you saw the film? And by the end, very strange, by the end of the film, Miles and the castle come to embody the ethos of the knitting group. They come to embody what was always going on in the background. And who was the catalyst for that transformation and went between the knitting group and the castle? It was Sophie. Things can change for the better in our world. Do you believe that things might actually get better here? That things can get better here? What part do you need to play in that? That's a question for you. What part do you need to play in this ongoing transformation, healing of our world? Are you going to be part of a casual grassroots group, constantly and faithfully working behind the scenes, like the knitting group, quite informal? Are you going to be part of something like that, a grassroots kind of thing? Or are you part of the big, old, clunky institution, sticking by it in the hope that you might help it change as you change? There's a beauty to that as well. Or are you the catalyst for transformation, going between the two, between the informal grassroots and the big old clunky institution? Are you going to be the middle person, the go-between, the one that helps that change and embody what's going on there? My gut feeling is that Worthing Baptist Church, on the whole, is the knitting group, aren't we? We're the knitting group. We are, yes we are. But who knows, maybe some of us who make up Worthing Baptist Church need to play other parts too. Maybe some of you are going to be catalysts and go between this informal group and some of the big institutions out there and help be the in-between. Bring some of the love and hospitality that you experience here to there. Or maybe you're also, as well as being part of here, you're also part of big, old, clunky institutions. And maybe actually this is helping you change, and therefore that could change the big, old, clunky institution. Who knows? I find it exciting. The world can change, but what part are we going to play in all of that? May we find our part in the transformation of the world. And as we welcome God this Christmas, that's what we're doing, welcoming God this Christmas, let's welcome other strangers too. Amen. Going to sing again, What Child Is This?